The North Vietnamese didn't name Son Tay Prison. American intelligence did. The compound sat 23 miles west of Hanoi in a river valley that flooded every monsoon season, which meant the place turned into a mud pit half the year. North Vietnamese forces had converted an old French colonial school into a POW facility, specifically because the location seemed impossible to attack. Thick jungle on 3 sides, open rice paddies on the 4th, anti-aircraft batteries positioned every few miles along the approach routes. They held 61 American prisoners there in late 1970, mostly downed pilots. The guards told prisoners that rescue was impossible. They weren't bluffing or trying to break morale. They genuinely believed it. American POWs in North Vietnam faced systematic torture, starvation rations, years of solitary confinement in cells barely large enough to lie down. The North Vietnamese interrogation methods had a name. Prisoners called it the ropes, where guards would bind a man's arms behind his back with rope and then tighten until shoulders dislocated. Medical treatment didn't exist. If you got dysentery, you either survived it or died. The Geneva Conventions were paper in Hanoi. North Vietnam didn't recognize them, didn't pretend to follow them, didn't care what the international community thought about their prison system. Son Tay represented something worse than just another prison. The facility's isolation meant the Red Cross never inspected it. No international observers, no oversight whatsoever. Prisoners there essentially vanished from the world. Some had been held incommunicado for 5 years by 1970. Their families back home didn't know if they were alive. The Pentagon knew. Aerial reconnaissance had photographed the compound multiple times, but couldn't do anything about it. Until someone asked, "What if we just went and got them?" That question sounds insane when you map out the logistics. Son Tay Prison sat deep inside enemy territory, surrounded by the most concentrated air defense network ever created. North Vietnam had stationed over 20,000 troops within 15 miles of the prison. The Hanoi area held more anti-aircraft guns per square mile than any place on Earth, including Moscow. Surface-to-air missile sites covered every approach vector. MiG fighter bases operated 24 hours. The whole region was designed to shred American aircraft. I don't know who first proposed the raid seriously, but by mid-1970 the idea had reached the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They didn't dismiss it immediately, which tells you something about how desperate the Pentagon felt regarding the POW situation. Public pressure was building. Families were organizing. The anti-war movement was attacking Nixon's handling of prisoners. Something needed to happen. The feasibility study came back saying the mission could theoretically work, maybe, if absolutely everything went perfectly and you had the right people executing it. The right people meant one person, really. The military had exactly one officer qualified to lead something this suicidal. Colonel Arthur Bull Simons was 52 years old in 1970, which made him ancient for special operations work. Most Green Berets retired or moved to desk jobs by their 40s. Simons had spent his entire career preparing for missions nobody else would touch. He'd led guerrilla operations in the Philippines during World War II, trained Chinese nationalist forces in Burma, run unconventional warfare programs in Laos that were so classified, even the CIA didn't know all the details. He looked like someone's grandfather, stocky, graying, unremarkable build. He also had a reputation for never losing men under his command. Never. That record mattered more than anything else for Son Tay. Simons got the call in May 1970 at Fort Bragg. Brigadier General Donald Blackburn summoned him to a secure conference room and laid out aerial photographs of Son Tay Prison on the table. Blackburn didn't waste time with preamble. He asked Simons if a raid was possible. Simons studied the photos for maybe 30 seconds and said yes. Not maybe, or we'd need to evaluate, or any qualified answer. Just yes. That's the kind of officer Simons was. He assessed whether Americans could accomplish something and gave you a straight answer. The Pentagon designated the Operation Ivory Coast and gave Simons complete authority to handpick his team. He wanted only volunteers, only Green Berets, only men who'd served in Vietnam already. No rookies, no glory seekers. Simons interviewed every candidate personally. He told them up front the mission was classified, dangerous, and probably suicidal. He didn't specify where they'd be going or what they'd be doing. More than 500 men volunteered anyway. Simons selected 56. Training started in June at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. The Special Operations community built a full-scale mock-up of Son Tay Prison in a restricted section of the base, using the aerial reconnaissance photos as blueprints. They replicated every building, every wall, every guard tower to exact dimensions. The mock-up included the courtyard layout, the cell block positions, even the drainage ditches. Nothing was approximate. Simons drove his men harder than any training regiment in Special Forces history. They rehearsed the raid in daylight first, then twilight, then total darkness. Every man memorized the entire compound layout, not just his assigned sector, but every sector. If you got wounded or killed, the guy next to you needed to complete your mission without stopping. They practiced with live ammunition. They practiced with helicopter insertions where the pilot would deliberately crash the aircraft into specific positions. Yes, deliberately crash. The plan required it. The training consumed 5 months, 170 total rehearsals. Simons would stop a drill mid-execution if someone hesitated for 2 seconds or moved 3 feet out of position. Then they'd start over from the beginning. The entire team could execute the raid blindfolded by September. Literally blindfolded. Simons made them do it that way to prove they knew every step. Meanwhile, intelligence analysts kept updating the photos of Son Tay. SR-71 reconnaissance flights and low-level Buffalo Hunter drone missions photographed the prison every few weeks. The analysts tracked everything: guard rotations, vehicle movements, how many prisoners appeared in the exercise yard. By October, the intelligence picture looked solid. 61 POWs confirmed. Predictable guard patterns. No indication the North Vietnamese suspected anything. Air Force planners worked parallel timelines developing the insertion routes. They needed to fly the helicopters 265 nautical miles from Thailand, cross into North Vietnamese airspace, navigate through the most lethal air defense network on the planet, and arrive at Son Tay within a 30-second window. Miss that window, and the whole operation collapsed. The fuel calculations alone were nightmarish. Helicopters don't have the range for that kind of mission normally. They'd be flying on fumes for the return trip. Simons didn't care about the odds. He cared about the execution. His team would have 18 minutes on the ground at Son Tay. 18 minutes to breach the compound, neutralize guards, locate prisoners, move them to the extraction helicopters, and lift off before North Vietnamese reinforcements arrived. 18 minutes to do what Hanoi said was impossible. The question wasn't whether American forces could reach Son Tay. The question was whether they'd find anyone alive when they got there. The Nevada desert doesn't look anything like Vietnam, but that's where the final training happened. Simons moved the entire team to Indian Springs Air Force Auxiliary Field in September. Isolated, secure, far enough from civilization that nobody would ask questions about helicopters crashing deliberately into mock prison compounds at 2 a.m. The team rebuilt the Son Tay replica there and continued rehearsals. They trained under conditions matching the actual raid timeline. November weather in North Vietnam meant cool temperatures, potential fog, no moon. Indian Springs simulated it. Every drill happened at night. Total darkness. No ambient light. The only illumination came from whatever the helicopters carried. Simons ran personality drills that seemed bizarre, but made sense in hindsight. He'd announce a guard tower position, point at a random team member, and demand immediate action without thinking. The guy had 3 seconds to recall tower location, optimal approach vector, suppression techniques, backup plans if the primary shooter got hit. Hesitation meant starting the entire evening's training over. Every operator memorized contingencies for contingencies. The helicopter pilots deserved their own medal just for training. The insertion plan required 6 aircraft, 5 HH-53 Super Jolly Green Giant helicopters, and 1 HH-3 Jolly Green. The HH-3 had a specific job: crash into the prison courtyard, not land hard, not make an emergency touchdown, deliberately crash into a precise spot to deliver Simons and his assault team directly inside the compound walls. The pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Zander, practiced this controlled crash hundreds of times. You can't really practice crashing, but Zander got as close as humanly possible. The other helicopters would land outside the walls in designated zones. Support teams would establish a perimeter, suppress guard towers, hold off reinforcements. The entire operation depended on synchronized timing down to seconds. If Banana 1, the call sign for Zander's helicopter, crashed 30 seconds early, the support teams wouldn't be in position. 30 seconds late, and guards would already be shooting at the courtyard. There was no margin for error. I think about the physical conditioning required, and it's absurd. These men were running full combat loads in 100-degree desert heat, executing room-clearing drills for hours, then immediately transitioning to helicopter insertions while exhausted. Simons wanted them operating effectively even after their bodies wanted to quit. Combat doesn't wait for you to catch your breath. By October, the team was ready, but intelligence started showing problems. Aerial reconnaissance photos from October revealed decreased activity at Son Tay. Fewer prisoners in the exercise yard. Some analysts thought the North Vietnamese might have moved POWs elsewhere. Others argued the photos were inconclusive. Maybe bad weather, maybe changed routines. Nobody knew for certain. The decision chain went all the way to President Nixon. Cancel or proceed. Nixon gave authorization on November 18th. The mission would launch November 20th, 1970. Either the prisoners were there or they weren't. Either way, America was sending a message to Hanoi. We can reach anywhere. Simons gathered his team for final briefing. He told them exactly where they were going, showed them the photos, explained the risks. He gave every man the option to back out with no questions asked, no shame, no record of refusal. Nobody backed out. The team loaded equipment and boarded transport aircraft for Thailand on November 19th. They landed at Udorn Royal Thai Air Force Base, the jumping-off point for the raid. Weather reports showed acceptable conditions over North Vietnam. The mission was happening. 56 Green Berets preparing to assault a prison 23 miles from Hanoi. The North Vietnamese had no idea what was coming. The helicopters lifted off from Udorn at 11:26 p.m. on November 20th, 1970. Formation flying at night over hostile territory with radio silence. Every pilot navigating by instruments and visual reference to the aircraft ahead. The route took them northwest across Laos, then east into North Vietnam, threading between known SAM sites and radar installations. They flew low, under 100 feet in some sections, using terrain masking to avoid detection. The Air Force ran a massive diversion simultaneously. A-1 Sky Raiders bombed targets near Haiphong. F-4 Phantoms struck airfields. F-105 Wild Weasels suppressed SAM sites along the Chinese border. Navy aircraft launched from carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin, hitting coastal targets. The entire operation was designed to pull North Vietnamese attention everywhere except Son Tay. It worked. North Vietnamese air defenses went active across the country, tracking multiple strike packages. Nobody noticed 6 helicopters approaching from the west. At 2:18 a.m., the formation reached Son Tay. Zander brought Banana 1 in first, the deliberate crash helicopter carrying Simons and 13 assault troops. He aimed for the courtyard center, flared at the last second, and pancaked the HH-3 into the compound exactly where he'd practiced. The landing gear collapsed on impact. The rotor blades struck trees and shattered. The fuselage buckled but stayed intact. 14 Green Berets poured out firing. Except something was immediately wrong. The compound was too quiet. No prisoners yelling. No guards shooting back. The assault team cleared the first cell block in 45 seconds and found nothing. Empty cells, no bunks, no personal items, no sign anyone had been there in months. Simons keyed his radio. Negative items. Negative items. Code phrase meaning no POWs. Outside the walls, the other helicopters had landed and support teams were establishing perimeter positions. They were taking fire now, North Vietnamese guards responding from towers and nearby buildings. But the fire was lighter than expected. Way lighter. Intelligence estimated 30 to 40 guards at Son Tay. There weren't 30 guards. There were maybe 12. The Green Berets kept clearing buildings anyway, because that's what Simons trained them to do. Every structure swept, every room checked. They found old prison equipment, abandoned guard posts, nothing recent. The North Vietnamese had moved the POWs sometime over the summer. Later investigation revealed the transfer happened in July due to flooding concerns and possibility of disease outbreak. American intelligence had missed it completely. But nobody panicked, nobody froze. The team continued executing the mission plan even though the entire reason for the raid no longer existed. That's training. That's discipline. When everything you planned for turns out to be wrong, you don't improvise wildly. You fall back on rehearsed procedures. Then someone noticed tracers coming from a different location 400 meters south. A walled compound the intelligence photos had labeled secondary school. Except secondary schools don't shoot at helicopters with heavy machine guns at 2:20 in the morning. The compound was actually a barracks facility housing between 100 and 200 North Vietnamese soldiers. One of the support helicopters, Apple III, had mistakenly landed near that compound instead of at Son Tay prison. The pilot, Major Frederick Donahue, realized the error within seconds, but his team was already on the ground taking fire from multiple positions. So they did what Green Berets do when outnumbered and in the wrong place. They attacked. 14 Americans against 200 North Vietnamese soldiers. The fight lasted 6 minutes. When it ended, the secondary school compound was a slaughterhouse, and every American was still combat effective. The team that hit the secondary school didn't have time to process what they'd landed in. They exited the helicopter into immediate contact, AK-47 fire from multiple buildings, guards running toward them, confused shouting in Vietnamese. The Green Berets established a perimeter in maybe 10 seconds and started systematically clearing the compound. Room clearing is violent work. You breach a door, throw in a grenade if appropriate, enter shooting anything that moves. These guys had done it so many times in training, they executed on pure muscle memory. The North Vietnamese troops weren't ready for combat at 2 a.m. Most were sleeping. Some were in various states of undress. None of that mattered. The Green Berets moved through the barracks buildings like a thresher through wheat. Captain Richard Meadows led the assault element that had landed at the actual Son Tay prison. He'd been first out of Zinder's crashed helicopter and first into the cell blocks. When he confirmed the prison was empty, he didn't waste time questioning why. He shifted his team to suppressing the guard towers and covering the extraction. The mission was already a failure in terms of rescuing POWs, but it could still succeed in getting everyone home alive. The firefight at the secondary school intensified. North Vietnamese troops who'd initially scattered were now organizing counterattacks. They had numbers, they had position, they had reinforcements potentially minutes away. What they didn't have was night vision equipment or the training to fight coordinated special operations troops in darkness. The Green Berets used that advantage ruthlessly. I need to be clear about what happened in that compound. This wasn't a fair fight. This wasn't even close to a fair fight. 14 Americans killed somewhere between 100 and 200 enemy soldiers in 6 minutes. The disparity sounds impossible until you understand the technology and training gap. American troops had suppressed weapons, night vision, rehearsed room-clearing techniques, and every man knew exactly what the guys next to him would do in any situation. The North Vietnamese had AK-47s and confusion. The entire Son Tay force was on the ground for 27 minutes total, 9 minutes longer than planned because of the secondary school firefight. Simons made the call to extract at 2:36 a.m. The helicopters that were still flyable, Banana One's crash landing had rendered it unsalvageable, lifted off with all personnel. They'd come for 61 POWs and found none. They'd accidentally attacked a barracks compound and annihilated the garrison. Now they needed to fly 265 nautical miles back to Thailand before North Vietnamese MiGs scrambled or SAM sites triangulated their position. The flight back was worse than the insertion. Every pilot knew their fuel margins were razor thin. The helicopters were shot up, not critically damaged, but definitely compromised. Navigation had to be perfect because one wrong turn meant running out of fuel over Laos with no recovery option. And now North Vietnamese air defenses were fully alert and searching. But the diversionary strikes were still active. American aircraft continued hitting targets across North Vietnam, keeping the defense network fragmented and reactive. The helicopter formation threaded back through the same route, low and fast, and somehow every SAM launched that night missed. Every MiG vectored toward them arrived too late. The aircraft limped into Udorn at 4:28 a.m. on fumes. Final casualty count for the raiders: 1 broken ankle. Staff Sergeant Leroy Wright had injured it during the helicopter crash landing. That was it. 1 broken ankle. 56 Americans had penetrated the most heavily defended airspace on Earth, assaulted a prison compound, fought a separate engagement against overwhelming numbers, and extracted with 1 non-combat injury. The North Vietnamese response to Son Tay tells you everything about how badly the raid shook them. Within 48 hours, every American POW in North Vietnam, scattered across multiple camps and prisons, was relocated to centralized facilities near Hanoi. The infamous Hanoi Hilton suddenly received hundreds of prisoners who'd been held in isolated camps for years. North Vietnamese forces consolidated POWs specifically because they feared America would launch more raids. Prison conditions improved immediately, not out of humanitarian concern, but tactical calculation. The North Vietnamese figured centralized facilities with more guards and better monitoring made rescue attempts harder. But concentrating prisoners also meant the Red Cross could finally inspect conditions, international observers could verify prisoner counts, and the brutal isolation tactics became impossible to maintain. POWs who'd spent years in solitary confinement suddenly had cellmates. Some men saw other Americans for the first time since their shootdown. The psychological impact on North Vietnam went beyond prison policy. Their propaganda had insisted American forces couldn't penetrate their defenses. Son Tay proved that was a lie. The raid demonstrated that nowhere in North Vietnam was truly safe. Not even facilities 23 miles from the capital, surrounded by thousands of troops and hundreds of anti-aircraft positions. If Americans could reach Son Tay, they could reach anywhere. Hanoi never publicly acknowledged the raid's success. Official North Vietnamese statements claimed they'd repelled an American attack and inflicted casualties. The casualty claims were fabrications. Not a single American died at Son Tay. The North Vietnamese, on the other hand, lost at least 100 soldiers at the secondary school compound alone, plus additional casualties from guard positions at the prison itself. The exact count remains classified or unknown, but estimates range from 100 to 200 killed. The American media initially portrayed Son Tay as a failure, because no POWs were rescued. That analysis misses the entire point. The mission failed its immediate objective, yes, but it succeeded in ways the Pentagon hadn't even anticipated. It forced North Vietnam to completely restructure their POW system. It demonstrated American capability to execute deep penetration raids. It sent a message to every captured pilot that their country hadn't forgotten them and was willing to risk everything for their recovery. The POWs themselves understood this better than anyone. When they learned about the raid, news filtered through the prison system within weeks. Morale skyrocketed. These men had endured years of torture and interrogation designed to break them psychologically. Many had been told their families thought they were dead, that America had abandoned them, that they'd die in North Vietnamese prisons. Son Tay proved all of that was propaganda. 56 Americans had flown into Hanoi's backyard to bring them home. The fact that the raid missed the prisoners didn't diminish what it represented. Bull Simons received the Distinguished Service Cross for leading the operation. Every man on the raid received the Silver Star minimum, with several receiving higher decorations. The Air Force pilots who flew the diversionary missions and the helicopter insertions received their own commendations. President Nixon personally met with the team and praised the operation publicly, despite the empty prison outcome. There's been endless debate about the intelligence failure. How did American reconnaissance miss the POW transfer from July until November? Some analysts argue the photographic interpreters focused too narrowly on confirming prisoners rather than detecting absence. Others point to the limitations of 1970s satellite technology and the difficulties of interpreting images through jungle canopy and monsoon cloud cover. The truth is probably simpler. Intelligence work is hard, people make mistakes, and even the best reconnaissance can miss crucial details. But the intelligence failure doesn't negate the operational success. The raid itself was flawless. Every element executed exactly as trained, despite the target being empty. The military studied Son Tay obsessively after the raid. Every aspect got analyzed: planning, training, execution, extraction. Special operations commanders wanted to understand what made the mission work operationally, even though it failed strategically. The answers shaped American special operations doctrine for the next 50 years. First lesson: rehearsal matters more than anything else. Simon's team ran 170 practice raids before the actual mission. That number seems excessive until you see the results. When the prison turned out empty and one helicopter landed at the wrong compound, nobody panicked. The team adapted because they drilled every possible contingency. Modern special operations forces still use this rehearsal model. Build mock-ups. Practice until execution becomes automatic. Rehearse until your body moves correctly, even when your brain is overwhelmed. Second lesson: personnel selection trumps equipment. Simons handpicked every operator and rejected volunteers who didn't meet his standards regardless of their qualifications on paper. He wanted men who'd performed under actual combat stress, not training school graduates with perfect scores. The equipment in 1970 was primitive compared to modern standards. No GPS, no thermal optics, limited night vision. The raiders succeeded because of who they were, not what they carried. Third lesson: violence of action overcomes numerical disadvantage. The secondary school engagement proved this absolutely. 14 Americans killed 200 enemy soldiers because they hit hard, moved fast, and never gave the North Vietnamese time to organize effective resistance. Hesitation gets you killed. Overwhelming aggression, even when outnumbered, creates chaos that trained troops can exploit. The raid also validated long-range helicopter operations into denied territory. Military planners had considered the mission profile too risky, the distances too far, the defenses too concentrated, the fuel margins too thin. Son Tay proved it could work if you planned meticulously and accepted the risks. This capability became fundamental to American special operations. Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, all of them trace their doctrinal roots to Son Tay's operational concepts. Bull Simons remained in the Army until 1971, then retired. He'd spent nearly 30 years in uniform, most of it doing things that stayed classified for decades. He died in 1979 at age 60. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery drew hundreds of Special Forces personnel, including most of the Son Tay Raiders. The man never sought publicity, never wrote memoirs, never appeared on talk shows. He just did the job and moved on. The Son Tay Raiders stayed connected after the mission. They held reunions, maintained friendships, watched each other's backs in subsequent assignments. That kind of bond forms when you volunteer for something suicidal and somehow survive it. These weren't men who bragged about their service or wore their decorations publicly. Most returned to regular Special Forces duties and continued their careers without fanfare. The empty prison haunted some of them. They'd trained for months, risked everything, executed perfectly, and still came home without the POWs. It's hard not to feel like you failed, even when the failure wasn't your fault. But talking to the POWs later, the men who'd been moved from Son Tay to Hanoi, changed that perspective. Those prisoners understood what the raid meant. They understood that 56 Americans had been willing to die for them. That knowledge sustained them through the remaining years of captivity. North Vietnam released the last American POWs in 1973 as part of the Paris Peace Accords. Operation Homecoming brought 591 prisoners home. Some had been captive for 8 years. They stepped off transport aircraft at Clark Air Base in the Philippines and American soil in California to enormous crowds and celebrations. Many credited Son Tay with giving them hope during the worst periods of captivity. The Son Tay Raid fundamentally changed how North Vietnam treated American prisoners, and that legacy matters more than the empty cells. Before November 1970, the North Vietnamese operated under the assumption that isolated camps scattered across the countryside provided security through obscurity. After Son Tay, they realized obscurity meant nothing against American intelligence and special operations capabilities. The consolidation of POWs into central Hanoi facilities wasn't a choice. It was a panic response. Torture decreased after the raid, though it never stopped completely. The North Vietnamese started following at least some Geneva Convention protocols because they feared what might happen if they didn't. The threat of another raid, of more American helicopters appearing without warning in the middle of the night, acted as a deterrent against the worst abuses. Some POWs reported that guards explicitly mentioned Son Tay when explaining why certain interrogation techniques were no longer authorized. The raid also demonstrated something crucial about American political will during Vietnam. By 1970, public support for the war had collapsed. Protests were constant. The anti-war movement dominated media coverage. Many assumed the Nixon administration would wind down operations and accept whatever terms North Vietnam offered. Son Tay sent the opposite message. America would escalate, would take enormous risks, would commit elite forces to deep penetration missions even as the war became increasingly unpopular at home. That unpredictability worried Hanoi more than B-52 strikes. Militarily, Son Tay validated the concept of special operations as a strategic tool rather than just tactical support for conventional forces.